What's up, everyone? Zavi Donabedian, a organic health movement team member at Awaken, New Mexico, coming to you today to present a video on neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity, of course, involves the brain and the nervous system. And to give you a clear, concise definition, neuroplasticity refers to the brain's ability to organize synaptic connections based on memory, learning, experience, or, in a maladaptive form, injury and or trauma. Intricate in the way that neuroplasticity works in the brain and the nervous system change and shift throughout your lifetime are the role of neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are simply chemical substances that arrive and are produced at the end of a synapse by the result of a nerve impulse. When that nerve impulse travels to the synapse, it causes the release of neurotransmitters, which then in turn turn on or turn off the synapse to which they are communicating. An example of a neurotransmitter would be serotonin, dopamine, GABA, anything within the brain that turns on or off different physiological functions. Secondly, the Hebb rule, neurons that fire together wire together, describes the way in which the brain adapts to the many different things that you do on a daily basis. So an example of the way in which your nervous system and your body changes over time can be seen in infant development. When we are infants, we learn to crawl and move in unique and specific ways that correspond to the different parts of our brain. The reptilian crawling phase, as you would see a baby scooting itself across the floor, is one example of the first stage in which the cervical spine, the first spinal curvature to develop in infancy, is not only being shaped by the baby's ability to pick up its head and move, but at the same time, that baby progresses from that phase to the mammalian crawling phase, which we would refer to as crawling on all fours. Now, all of those changes correspond to changes in the brain and changes in the nervous system. So you must understand that we are very susceptible to external and internal environmental change as infants that determine the way in which we progress into our physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being as adults. Vandenberg et al. Showed that HPA axis dysregulation, hypothalamus pituitary adrenal dysregulation, or an overstimulation of that pathway in the maternal phase of an infant's life, such that they are in the womb, can predispose that individual to mental or somatic illness in the future. That is to say that nutrient deprivation, maternal anxiety, all correspond to the way in which our brain, our nervous system, and our physiology develops over time. This is especially true for stress-related disorders in which HPA axis dysregulation plays a role in pathophysiological dysfunction. So we start to see that the way that neurons firing together, wiring together, has a profound influence on our mental health, the structure of our brain, and our nervous system. Another important part of neuroplasticity is long-term potentiation. Let's say we have synapse A and synapse B. Now, when the nerve impulse reaches synapse A, it stimulates synapse B to receive the information that is coming through that nerve impulse. Now, over time, the metabolic change that occurs within those two synapses is increased and is strengthened. Therefore, long-term potentiation refers to the dynamic changes in which the brain and the synapses communicate with each other to a heightened degree, or to the path of least resistance. There are 4 types of neuroplasticity. The first describes adaptive neuroplasticity, such as when a child or a young adult is learning a new language or learning a new skill, and the adaptive changes that happen in the brain allow that individual to progress, grow, and expand the knowledge to expand the nervous system impulse they have created through their learning pattern. The second refers to impaired neuroplasticity, which is the expression of genetic disorders that impair the brain's ability to function properly. Thirdly would be the maladaptive form of neuroplasticity. So consider within the Czech system we talk about motor patterns, motor engrams quite a bit. And for the layperson, that means the way in which movement patterns are stored in your nervous system. Now, if you've been exercising with poor form for the majority of your life, that is an example of maladaptive neuroplasticity. Because every time you go to do an exercise with poor form, your nervous system can only fire based on what it knows, what it has been programmed to do. So consider that it takes 300 to 500 reps to create good form within the nervous system, but 3,000 to 5,000 reps to undo bad form and to create a good pattern within the nervous system. So the nervous system is highly adaptive, and these different rules, the ways in which neuroplasticity function, they are very strong and have a big influence on your health. The fourth and final form of neuroplasticity is excessive neuroplasticity, such that the excessive exposure to certain types of stimuli create maladaptive traits within the brain that can cause disability or disorder. So that would be an example of drug addiction. Drug addiction releases a lot of dopamine, releases a lot of feel-good hormones within the body. However, over time, the depletion or the lack of exposure to that drug will cause the individual to have cravings, depression, anxiety, a whole host of physiological symptoms, because that pathway is not being fed by its original stimulus. Consider environment plus genetics plus inner world determines outer expression. We already went over the example of HPA axis dysregulation causing a somatic change in the individuals who are exposed to it in vitro. Another example of this is a wonderful study, Lobo et al., 2008, showing that different rays and intensities of light upon cocoons of a caterpillar determined the ways in which the colors of the wings of those butterflies coming out of the cocoons express themselves. Consider that genetics, the way in which your lineage, your ancestry has developed in order to survive the natural selection of nature, also determines the way in which your brain will express itself. So we see that with neurodegeneration, with some inherited Alzheimer's risks, for example, different components of your genetic disposition that cause changes in the brain that are more likely to happen in the case that you are of a lineage where that has been previously expressed. And finally, the most important part of this, the number one component of HPA axis dysregulation would be your inner world or your perception, meaning that the way in which you live your life, the way in which your emotions, your breath, your psyche function all have an intricate influence over the way that the brain works. And putting these three together, you have a formula for neuroplasticity where you can start to evaluate your life and see which components are contributing to your success, your suboptimal choices, or the way in which you may be indifferent, the three choices that you have on a daily basis. Finally, I'll end just with an example of what it looks like to live in a positive alignment of neuroplasticity versus a negative alignment. Now, neurogenesis refers to the increase in production of nervous system cells in response to different stimuli. An example of this would be exercise-induced increase in BDNF in the hippocampus, which contributes to learning and memory. The maladaptive form of this would be neurodegeneration, which is the decrease of neural function and structure. This could be due to chemical exposure. This could be due to maladaptive traits such as drug addiction, as I mentioned, neuron bundle damage, genetic expressions such as in Alzheimer's, with the example here being something like Parkinson's, in which there's decreased nerve signaling and decreased dopamine, leading to feelings of depression and leading to motor problems. And we see through the work of Moshe Feldenkrais, John Pepper, Norman Doidge, other phenomenal contributors to the world of neuroplasticity, that these types of genetic predispositions can be changed by your inner world and your environment. So you must look at this formula to see where you're disposed to a maladaptive exposure expression of neuroplasticity and take your time to live in harmony with your values, your dreams, the way in which you feel alive, and the way in which you feel you can contribute best to the world in a way that's loving, empowered, and most of all, beneficial to your brain.